late August 1944, in a command tent somewhere between Cherbourg and the German border in France. Major General John Chapter Lee, commander of the communication zone, the lifeline supplying every American soldier in Europe, stood over a map showing a grim reality. Red lines marked nearly empty fuel depots. Blue arrows traced Patton's Third Army stalled 100 miles short of Germany. Their tanks were not silenced by enemy fire, but by something far more mundane: empty fuel tanks. The most powerful mechanized force in history had come to a stop for the least glamorous reason imaginable. They lacked trucks. Not brilliant tactics, not courage, not weaponry. Trucks, lots and lots of trucks. Lee understood the brutal equation. Without trucks delivering fuel, tanks were nothing but metal statues. Without trucks carrying ammunition, the guns went quiet. Without trucks hauling food, soldiers went hungry. The entire machinery of American power had been brought to a halt by a shortage of cargo vehicles. Just 6 months earlier, during invasion planning, generals had dismissed the CCKW as a mere logistics vehicle, hardly worth mentioning alongside tanks, aircraft, and artillery. It had none of the drama of armor smashing through hedgerows, nor the glory of fighters strafing enemy lines. Just a truck, a 2.5-ton cargo hauler existing on the periphery of military imagination. What they failed to realize was that this very truck would become America's most decisive weapon in Europe. Not because it could destroy the enemy, though some carried machine guns, but because it could sustain an army across an entire continent. The CCKW, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half by drivers and the Jimmy by passengers, would move more tonnage, cover more miles, and prove more vital than any tank or plane. Over 500,000 of these identical vehicles, driven by men who never sought glory, won the war 1 mile, 1 ton, 1 delivery at a time. In 1939, as Europe slid into war, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps faced a logistical nightmare born from 2 decades of neglect. After World War I, massive demobilization left the Army with a chaotic mix of outdated trucks. By 1935, the Holabird Motor Transport School reported 360 different models, requiring nearly 1 million spare parts that no one could properly track or supply. One broken part might fit only 3 trucks nationwide. Mechanics trained on Fords couldn't fix Chevrolets, as each required unique tools and procedures. This wasn't just an administrative mess, it was a reflection of flawed priorities. Military thinking still revolved around destroying the enemy, not sustaining the fight. Tanks captured imagination and funding. Artillery earned respect. Even the Jeep found its fame in reconnaissance. But supply trucks? They were forgotten. Necessary, yes, but boring. Generals planned battles without truly considering logistics beyond basic math. No manuals, no medals, no glory. Yet the best military minds knew better. Napoleon didn't lose in Russia because of courage, but because his supply line stretched too far. The Confederacy faltered at Gettysburg partly because ammunition wagons failed to arrive. The German spring offensive of 1918 collapsed when troops outran their supplies. The lesson was timeless. Amateurs study tactics. Professionals study logistics. So, when the Quartermaster Corps began drafting specifications for a new truck in 1939, it did so quietly without fanfare, unaware that it was creating one of the war's most decisive weapons. The requirements were simple but visionary. Carry 2.5 tons, enough for real cargo but still compact for naval transport and narrow European roads. Have 6-wheel drive for mud, sand, snow, and broken terrain. Use commercial components for mass production. Above all, be reliable, easy to maintain, and buildable in staggering numbers by a civilian auto industry. General Motors, through its Yellow Coach division, submitted a design based on a truck originally intended for France in 1939. France fell before it could be delivered. The British found early models disappointing and sent them to the Soviets. But GMC engineers saw potential. Throughout 1940 and 1941, they refined it, strengthening the chassis, improving the engine transmission, and simplifying the cab. The designation CCKW came from GMC's system. C for 1941, C for conventional cab, K for all-wheel drive, W for dual rear axles. The short 145-inch wheelbase became the CCKW 352, the long 164-inch version, the CCKW 353, dominated production at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The prototypes faced brutal testing, mud, sand, steep grades, rocks, overloading, and non-stop engine runs. The CCKW passed it all. Production contracts were issued in early 1941, months before Pearl Harbor. The first 8,000 trucks rolled out that year, used for training and equipping new divisions. They were practical, reliable, unremarkable. Just trucks that worked. When Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Eisenhower reviewed equipment lists before Pearl Harbor, he noted them without comment. Armies needed trucks. This one met the need. That was enough. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. The United States shifted to total war by January 1942. CCKW production surged. Chevrolet St. Louis plant joined in. Monthly output leapt from hundreds to thousands, then to tens of thousands. By mid-1942, nearly 20,000 rolled off the lines each month. Designs were streamlined. In July 1943, closed metal cabs were replaced with open canvas tops, saving steel, reducing shipping weight, and improving visibility and escape options in combat. Some received winches, others 50-caliber ring mounts. At its core was the GMC 270 engine, a six-cylinder gasoline power plant producing 91.4 horsepower. Modest by performance standards but incredibly durable. It used common parts, ran on standard fuel, and tolerated dust, mud, and neglect. The Warner T935 speed gearbox offered precise control with an overdrive fifth gear for long hauls, leaf spring suspension, balanced comfort, and load-bearing strength. The CCKW wasn't revolutionary for its technology, but for its scale and integration. Other nations had good trucks. Germany's Opel Blitz, Britain's Bedford QL, the Soviet Gas AA, but none could match America's industrial scale. Between 1941 and 1945, General Motors built over 528,000 CCKWs. Excluding the amphibious DUKW variant, Germany produced just 15,000 standardized 3-ton trucks. In total, the Soviets built hundreds of thousands, but still relied heavily on horses. Japan's truck production was negligible. The GM CCKW became the second most produced American vehicle of the war, surpassed only by the Jeep, of which 640,000 were built. This single model accounted for nearly 1/4 of all U.S. military trucks built during the war. By spring 1943, as Allied forces prepared for Sicily, Italy, and eventually France, Major General John Chapter Lee's logistics staff began the math. A single infantry division in combat consumed about 650 tons of supplies every day. Food, fuel, ammunition, medical stocks, spare parts, engineering equipment. An armored division needed even more, around 700 tons when engaged. Multiply that by dozens of divisions, then add support units, air forces, and reserves, and the numbers became staggering. Tens of thousands of tons daily, millions monthly. All of it had to move from coastal ports through depots to combat units hundreds of miles inland. Traditionally, long-distance transport relied on railroads with trucks handling only short-range distribution. But the pre-invasion bombing campaign, essential to cripple German communications, also devastated France's rail network. Bridges collapsed, locomotives were destroyed, tracks cratered, and stations burned. So, when the Allies landed, they discovered that the railroads were in ruin. Every drop of fuel, every shell, every ration would have to move by truck. Not just supplementing rail, but replacing it entirely for months. At first, the challenge seemed manageable. After the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, Allied forces operated near the beaches, where distances were short and supply routes compact. Planners assumed the breakout would take weeks, allowing time to open ports and repair rails. Instead, Operation Cobra, launched July 25, blew the German lines apart. Patton's newly activated Third Army turned the breach into a route, driving eastward at breathtaking speed. His armored columns advanced up to 80 miles a week, slashing across France. By mid-August, some units were 200 miles from Normandy. Paris was liberated on August 25. By early September, Patton's reconnaissance units were approaching the German border. It seemed the war could end by Christmas. But as the armies raced forward, their supply lines stretched to breaking point. Every mile forward meant a truck had to drive 2 miles, one loaded heading east and one empty, returning west. What began as short 40-mile hauls grew to 80, then to 160, and eventually over 400 miles as front lines neared Germany while supplies still came from Cherbourg. Antwerp, the next major port, wouldn't open until late November. With railways unusable, everything depended on trucks, thousands of them running non-stop in an impossible relay to keep the advance alive. But there simply weren't enough. Planners had assumed railroads would soon carry the burden, that offensives would pause periodically. None of those assumptions held true. By late August, Patton's Third Army was burning through 800,000 gallons of fuel per day. First Army consumed roughly the same combined, 1.6 million gallons daily, not counting the British or air operations. No system on Earth could sustain that volume. Over 500 miles of wrecked countryside. Fuel depots ran dry. Tank battalions sat immobilized, crews watching helplessly as German forces escaped. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Artillery rationed shells. Even rations fell short. The great advance that had promised to end the war stalled because the U.S. Army literally ran out of gas. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an agonizing choice. He commanded 3 Army groups advancing on a broad front. Montgomery's 21st Army Group pushing toward the Netherlands and the Ruhr. Bradley's 12th Army Group, including Patton's 3rd Army, driving toward the Sauer. Devers's 6th Army Group advancing from southern France, all required massive daily resupply. All had valid operational goals, but the logistics network couldn't support them all at once. Eisenhower chose a broad front strategy, spreading limited supplies to maintain pressure along the entire front rather than risking everything on one narrow thrust. Montgomery protested bitterly, claiming concentration could have taken Berlin. Patton insisted the Third Army could have ended the war in 1944 if given priority. The argument has never been settled. What's beyond dispute is this logistics-dictated strategy. The pace of the advance was set not by willpower or courage, but by fuel, tires, and tonnage. In this crisis, transportation officers conceived a radical plan, the Red Ball Express, an emergency convoy system that would prove what organized trucking could achieve. The name came from railroad jargon, where Red Ball meant express freight with top priority. Colonel Loren Albert Ayers designed the system during a frantic 36-hour planning session. The concept was simple, but on an unprecedented scale. 2 parallel roads would be dedicated exclusively to supply convoys marked with red circles. One route carried loaded trucks east, the other returned them empty heading west. Military police manned every intersection, halting all other traffic to let the convoys roar through. Drivers worked in teams, often swapping places while the trucks were still moving. They ran day and night. Repairs were minimal. The mission, maximum tonnage forward, no delays. The Red Ball Express began operations on August 25, 1944, with roughly 6,000 vehicles, most of them CCKWs. Convoys covered the 400-mile round trip between Cherbourg and Chartres, hauling about 12,500 tons daily. The express ran for 83 days until November 16th, when Antwerp opened and rail service resumed. In that time, it delivered between 412,000 and 500,000 tons of supplies to 28 divisions, enough to keep the entire Western Front moving. Without it, the offensive would have collapsed, but the human cost was immense. Of the 23,000 soldiers who ran the convoys, about 3/4 were African American men assigned to segregated service units, now performing one of the most grueling duties of the war. They drove 20-hour shifts, sometimes 72 hours without rest, through blackout nights without headlights, often under threat of ambush. Fatigue was constant, but failure wasn't an option. Frontline soldiers depended on them. Meal breaks existed mostly on paper. Drivers ate on the move. Regulations requiring convoys of 5 with escorts were ignored. Trucks departed singly as soon as they were loaded. Speed governors limiting vehicles to 56 miles per hour were disabled. Drivers routinely hit 70 miles per hour on narrow French roads. Overloading was a constant. 2.5-ton trucks often carried 4 or even 5 tons, pushing every component beyond design limits. Tires shredded at catastrophic rates. The Red Ball consumed around 50,000 tires in just 83 days. Spare parts ran out. Mechanics cannibalized broken trucks to keep others running. Vehicles rolled with worn bearings, failing suspensions, and damaged electrics. Accidents were frequent. Overloaded CCKW skidded off muddy roads, flipped or collided in darkness. Wrecked trucks lined the routes, stripped for parts and abandoned. British troops joked that when Red Ball convoys approached, it was safer to climb a tree. French civilians learned to clear the roads at the sound of roaring engines, and yet the CCKW endured. Its commercial engine kept running despite continuous use. Its drivetrain, suspension, and frame survived punishment no designer could have imagined. Breakdowns were frequent, but never catastrophic. Enough stayed running. Factories kept replacements coming, mechanics kept the rest alive with ingenuity and grit, and the supplies got through. General George S. Patton himself recognized what this meant. He famously remarked that his tanks were worthless without gasoline. The true heroes of his advance were not the man in armor, but the truck drivers who made the tanks move. Fuel trucks once again turned tanks into weapons. When the Third Army finally received enough fuel to resume its advance, General Patton personally visited the Red Ball staging areas to thank the drivers, a rare gesture from a man not known for sentiment towards support troops. By late 1944, commanders who once viewed cargo trucks as mere background elements had completely revised their opinions. Between 1939 and December 1945, the United States purchased 2.4 million trucks. Roughly 812,000 of these were 2.5-ton models, and of that number, GMC produced over 520,000 CCKWs, the overwhelming majority. This single model made up 1/4 of all American truck production during the war. These vehicles operated everywhere American forces went. Through Pacific jungles that turned to mud during monsoons, across North African deserts where temperatures soared past 130 degrees, up steep Italian mountain roads, hauling ammunition through narrow switchbacks. In the frozen wilderness of Alaska and Canada, functioning in sub-zero cold. In Burma, navigating the treacherous Lido Road, and in Europe during the bitter winter of the Battle of the Bulge. The CCKWs were there too. Wherever American troops fought, these trucks followed, carrying the immense loads that armies required to fight. In his 1948 memoir, General Eisenhower listed the CCKW among the 6 most vital weapons that won the war, alongside the atomic bomb, radar, the C-47 transport, the Jeep, and the landing ship tank. For the Supreme Allied commander to place a cargo truck in the same category as nuclear weapons showed a complete rethinking of military power. Before the war, strategy focused almost entirely on combat strength and firepower, an approach that proved dangerously narrow. The Red Ball Express exposed that weakness dramatically. When Patton's tanks ran out of fuel, they were useless. When the CCKWs arrived with fuel, those same tanks became deadly weapons again. Trucks didn't replace tanks or aircraft. They made all of them possible. Without the constant supply chain those trucks provided, the most powerful army ever assembled would have been unable to move. The German Wehrmacht never managed to replicate America's truck-based logistics system. Germany produced capable vehicles, but in limited numbers, never on the same industrial scale or with the same organizational discipline. The Wehrmacht remained heavily dependent on horses. Even in 1944, German infantry divisions relied on them for transport. When the German army advanced, it often outran its supplies. When it retreated, it was forced to abandon equipment because it lacked enough trucks to evacuate it. This happened again and again. German generals were defeated not by superior tactics, but by superior Allied logistics. The Soviets receiving American trucks through the Lend-Lease program valued them so much that post-war Soviet designs were modeled after American examples, especially the Studebaker US-6. Many of the famous Katyusha rocket launchers were mounted on American trucks, giving them mobility that Soviet-made vehicles couldn't provide. After the war, Soviet veterans openly acknowledged that American trucks had played a crucial role in victory. Alongside Soviet tanks and soldier bravery, the British also developed strong logistics operations and contributed significantly to the Allied war effort. But they relied heavily on American-made vehicles to supplement their own production. British Bedford QL trucks performed well, but American manufacturing capacity outproduced Britain by a massive margin. This industrial strength built on decades of commercial automobile production, became America's decisive advantage, and the CCKW symbolized it. It wasn't the most sophisticated, the fastest, or the most comfortable vehicle. It wasn't heavily armored or powerful, but it was tough enough to keep running under abuse, easy to repair with basic tools, and available in numbers so vast that losses hardly mattered. It could operate in conditions that would destroy more delicate designs. The drivers, tens of thousands who spent the war behind steering wheels instead of guns, received little recognition then and even less afterward. Hollywood celebrated combat heroes, not truck drivers. No one made movies about supply convoys. Popular memory focused on infantry assaults and tank battles, but the soldiers who lived through it knew better. Infantrymen recognized the courage of those convoys that delivered ammunition under fire. Tank crews knew the drivers who ran fuel through contested territory risked their lives just as much. The Red Ball Express, manned primarily by African American soldiers serving in a segregated army that denied them equal rights, became legendary among those who understood what logistics truly meant. These men drove brutal hours through hazardous terrain, meeting impossible schedules, performing exhausting work with remarkable discipline, all while knowing they would return home to a nation still practicing racism. When the war ended in May 1945, the massive fleet of CCKWs faced an uncertain future. Tens of thousands were declared surplus and sold to civilians, foreign governments, or scrapped. Many continued serving in the U.S. military through the Korean War, and some remained in National Guard units into the early 1960s. Foreign militaries operated them for decades, in some cases into the 1990s, where their simple mechanics made them ideal for harsh conditions that destroyed modern vehicles. When the M35 replaced the CCKW in the 1950s, it retained many of the older truck's proven features while adding better powertrains and electrical systems. The concept of a standard 2.5-ton 6x6 medium truck stayed virtually unchanged, a direct legacy of the CCKW. Today, surviving CCKWs are prized by collectors and preserved in museums around the world. Though 75 to 80 years old, many still run reliably when properly maintained, proof of their durable design. Restored CCKWs painted olive drab with white stars represent far more than antique vehicles. They stand for the more than 500,000 trucks that crossed oceans, spanned continents, endured combat, and delivered the supplies that made victory possible. The story of the CCKW is ultimately the story of how wars are truly won. Not in the way we imagine. We celebrate dramatic battles and daring assaults. We praise brilliant commanders and marvel at powerful weapons. All of that happened in World War II, but none of it would have mattered without the steady flow of supplies behind the lines. The CCKW didn't storm beaches, shoot down aircraft, or destroy tanks. It carried the fuel that made aircraft fly and tanks move. It hauled ammunition so soldiers could fight. It delivered rations so armies could eat and spare parts so weapons could be repaired. Without that constant movement of supplies, the war machine would have ground to a halt. Generals who once dismissed the CCKW as just another utility truck learned their mistake through hard experience. When Patton's tanks ran dry, when Eisenhower halted advances because supplies couldn't get through, when the Red Ball Express became the last lifeline to prevent collapse, they learned lessons that would shape military thinking for generations. The GMCCKW, the Deuce and a Half. The Jimmy. The truck, once overlooked by generals, became the weapon that truly won the war. Not through firepower, armor, or speed, but through the most fundamental power of all, the ability to keep an army supplied until victory was achieved.